Welcome to the number one MSU basketball podcast in America. The Final Four is not on the schedule. Join Rod and me, Eric, as we dive deep into the Spartans to get you prepared for every game. Subscribe today for in-depth recruiting updates and fantastic interviews with today's important college basketball personalities like Robbie Hummel.
Thank you for having me. I have listened to your guys' podcast numerous times on drives throughout any Midwestern Big Ten city. So I am big fans of your guys' work.
Jay Billis.
And next time, hey, if anybody in Michigan wants a December tea time, call me. You wimps won't show up, but I'll be there. I'll be there and play in the cold. And Izzo will be in front of the fire with hot chocolate.
Coaches Thomas Kelly.
No problem. Glad to be back, man. Glad to be back.
Mike Garland.
You just can't sit there and trade twos for threes. You can't do it. You're going to lose. Coming down the stretch, you're going to lose.
And more. You won't find better coverage of Spartan hoops than you will get here. For both the casual and hardcore fan, come along as we take you for a green and white ride. Hey everybody, it's Eric alongside Rod here for our final Big Ten preview show. Rod's projected number one team, the Michigan State Spartans. Before we begin, we'd like to thank Michael Kistler, who joined at the Scott Skiles level in Patreon, and thanks to Kenneth Kramer for a one-time payment via PayPal. We do the show, Rod and I, because we love MSU basketball just like you. Obviously, if you want to support what we do, there are a number of ways that you can do that. The easiest is to go to thefinalfourisnotintheschedule.com/support, or if you're lazy, tffinots.com/support, where you can find links to send donations via PayPal or Venmo, or recurring monthly support through Patreon and Substack, and the benefits of that are described in the Patreon page. We'd really like to add one or two more businesses as sponsors to the show. It's a great way to get in front of some rabid Spartan fans, so if you're interested, shoot me an email at eric@tffinots.com, that's ERIC, or if there's some other way you'd like to support the Final Four is not on the schedule, I'm happy to talk. Most of your support to the show goes to cover the infrastructure and promotion to other Spartan fans. Finally, a great way to help the show continue to grow is to share it with your friends and family. Listenership for the show has grown a ton over the past 2 years, putting our show often inside the top 100 basketball podcasts in America, and as high as a top 35 show, which we feel pretty fortunate and is pretty amazing for just a college basketball show. So continue leaving reviews on your podcast player, which helps the algorithms send more Spartan fans our way. But now let's talk about the Michigan State Spartans and a brief recap of last season. Last season was up and down for Michigan State, coming off two straight disappointing seasons, at least by program standards. Of course, Michigan State opened after a tune-up with a win over Northern Arizona with a tight 1-point loss to Gonzaga on an aircraft carrier, a loss which left most of us feeling pretty good with a close win given the opponent and quality of the performance. They then beat Kentucky by 9 in double overtime to further encourage optimism. That was followed by a 2-point win at home over Villanova in a game which actually wasn't that close for the vast majority of the way, but tightened up at the very end. So MSU sat 3-1 and looked pretty good doing it. Then the injuries hit. Already out Jaden Akins with a foot injury that was suffered late in summer, and he'd just been recovering to the point where he was just maybe coming back from the injury, and then Malik Hall hurts his foot before the trip out to Oregon for the PK 85. So that meant MSU went into the loaded Phil Knight Invitational, down two key players, and the results showed. They lose pretty comprehensively to Alabama, battle their way to tight wins over Oregon and Portland, but I don't think anybody was really fooled about where this team stood from a depleted standpoint and personnel. Then came the road game at Notre Dame, which was probably the low point of the season. Exhausted and attritioned MSU team lost to a very, very bad Irish team by 18 on the road. And that in turn was followed by a home court loss to Northwestern to open Big Ten play, which of course turns out Northwestern was better than we thought. But all that early optimism we had was gone. Yet, as Michigan State did throughout the year, they got off the mat. They showed a lot of resiliency and went out to Penn State College and beat Penn State team by 9 on the road, which turns out to actually be a pretty good win after we saw how Penn State's season turned out. That gave the Spartans momentum and bought them time to get Akins and Hall back into the lineup and to reintegrate with the team. 3 easy non-conference wins set the stage for Michigan State to get back into conference play. State ripped off 3 straight wins and seemed to be heading to Champaign-Urbana with a matchup against Illini with a bunch of positive momentum. Unfortunately, it was dashed by a tough ending, but also, more importantly, Malik Hall re-injured his foot. So the gut punch of a 1-point loss the next game at home to Purdue followed, and Michigan State was suddenly at 4-3 in the league. After a number of games, Michigan State got back up to 8-6 in the league, and then sort of going up and down as they tried to steady the ship before they got back to full health. And then the horrible shooting incident in February happened on campus. The Minnesota game, which was scheduled, was postponed and ended up never getting played, which meant Michigan State's first game back was back in Ann Arbor on the road. A strong performance was sort of tainted by a late game collapse, which allowed Michigan to grab the win and drop Michigan State to 8-7. Michigan State then returned with a feel-good win at home against Indiana in a blowout win, and it felt like things are back on track. And then, despite the great play against the Iowa Hawkeyes in Iowa City, a completely incomprehensible late game collapse led to a loss in Iowa. They closed with wins over Nebraska and Ohio State to finish 11-8 in the league, and had Minnesota been played, most likely 12-8, and Michigan State finishes probably tied for the three-way tie for second place. But it still felt like this is an unpredictable team, and that feeling wasn't changed by the Spartans' really poor performance, and especially with A.J. Hoggard disappointing performance in the Big Ten opener loss to Ohio State in the tournament. Yet, as we've seen often in East Lansing, the best was saved for last. Michigan State drew a solid USC team in the first round game, a group with some strong offensive performers, and the Spartans handled the Trojans by 10, controlling the game pretty much throughout the game. That set up around a 32 tilt against the Big East champion, the Marquette Golden Eagles. Marquette was a popular pick to get to at least the Elite Eight. But, as usual, Michigan State had other ideas. MSU's guards outplayed Marquette's highly regarded group and received strong scoring and rebounding efforts from Joey Hauser and Mady Sissoko to win the game by 9 and get Tom Izzo to his 15th Sweet 16. Waiting for them was Kansas State, another strong offensive team, and in probably what's arguably the best tournament game of the year, the Sweet 16 matchup, Michigan State just couldn't get enough stops when it mattered, and it ended up falling by 5 in overtime. It was a disappointing, frustrating end of the season, but MSU showed that in this tournament run how good a team they could be, and with all the players returning for the most part outside of Joey Hauser, a lot of optimism into what could happen this season, especially with the new recruiting class.
We'll start at the end first. So there's this old line about Tom Izzo teams, which has reached the level of cliche that, well, they're playing their best basketball at the end of the season. But it's actually true most of the time. Not every year, but even during, let's consider the last 3 years, actually one of the low points of Izzo's tenure, which says something about Izzo's tenure, right? That all 3 years you're a tournament team. Their record is 3-3 in the tournament. So not brilliant by MSU standards, but we're not talking about, let's say Purdue's track record over the last 3 years in the tournament. But yeah. I think you look at these last 3 years and as we say, kind of a low point of his tenure, and it was true all 3 years. You think back to the COVID year, Michigan State really was in danger more so than any other year during this streak of not making the tournament, because at the end of the season they weren't sitting in good position anyway, and then they had to run through a gauntlet of top 5, top 10 teams. The good news about that was it gave them an opportunity to rack up significant victories, which would be needed to make a case, to build a resume for tournament inclusion. And that's exactly what they went out and did. And then once they got to the tournament, they lost that heartbreaking game to UCLA in overtime. But little did we know in a play-in game that UCLA was going to go all the way to the Final Four. The year following, MSU was not playing its best basketball. In fact, I think you could say they were playing their worst basketball at the end of the regular season. If you remember, there were some ugly losses down the stretch at Michigan, at Ohio State, really, really bad. They were okay in the Big Ten tournament.
Yeah.
And then they went out, beat Davidson in the first round of the NCAA tournament, a tough Davidson team, and then gave Duke, who ended up in the Final Four, everything they wanted. MSU led that game at the under 4 timeout before fading. So once again, you could say, well, they saved their best for last. You could argue that the Davidson and Duke games were two of the best games they played all season. Last year, obviously, it was the point that once the NCAA tournament hit, that was Michigan State at its best. Played very well against USC, played outstanding basketball to beat a Marquette team that not only won the Big East regular season, but they also won the Big East tournament. So validation, and a very good Big East that actually had the NCAA champion eventually in Connecticut among its membership. And Marquette, I believe, swept UConn last year. So a very good Marquette team that Michigan State, kind of the flip side of what happened to them the year prior against Duke. Tight game at the under 4, and then MSU just controlled the last 4 minutes and pulled away. And then they played in the Sweet 16 against a very capable Kansas State team, what I think was probably the highest quality game. I'm trying to be as objective as I can be, but I do think from a neutral perspective, it probably was the best game, most entertaining game of the entire tournament. Both teams making huge plays, trading body blows back and forth. And in the end, Kansas State just made a play or two more to win it. So it capped what was, as you said, very much an up and down season. If we go back to the beginning now, Michigan State got off to a very good start. And I think everybody was feeling very good about where the team stood after that Villanova win. Two things there. One, we didn't yet know that Gonzaga and Kentucky and Villanova, which honestly, you're not going to find many threesomes of name brand opponents that have better credibility than those three. But all of them failed to meet preseason expectations. Never mind reach the normal standards of recent years for those programs. Well, we couldn't know that in November, So you could say, well, maybe those wins didn't say as much as we thought at the time. And that's not unfair. But the bigger thing was that, as you mentioned, MSU saw its injury situation go from bad to worse when Malik Hall got hurt to join Jaden Akins. And I think that had a lot to do with Michigan State's inconsistency, to be honest.
Yeah.
When you're taking two of your top 6 and not just eliminating them from some games, but then you have to factor in, what are they when they get back? Are they the guy that you anticipated they would be in the fall? Well, no, not for a while. I think it took Jaden Akins until, I would say, the last few weeks of the regular season before he was truly back.
Yep.
And the guy that they thought he would be. Malik Hall never got there.
No, he
really.
He was never.
I mean,
he was the first couple games. The Kentucky game is kind of his.
Yeah,
that was it.
He was arguably their best player before he got hurt against Villanova.
Yep.
And then it was just a matter of his trying to gut it out to help the team. He wasn't the guy that he would have been. I feel secure in saying that. So that had a lot to do with it. Because remember, not a very deep team. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about MSU's improved depth, and it is substantially. Last year, we're not talking about a deep team. You take 2 of your top 6 out, and then what do you have left after that? Well, you've got 3 freshmen, all of whom have great potential, but none of whom was really ready, I think, to be a game in, game out consistent contributor last season. That's the way it turned out. You have a sophomore in Pierre Brooks who had an opportunity to seize a role, but wasn't able to do it successfully. So, and then you get beyond that, you're talking about non-scholarship players.
Right.
So this was not a very deep team. So when you take 2 of your top 6 out, and then even when they come back, they're back kind of in name only. They're not really what they were. That's going to have an impact. And I think it did. It had a lot to do with why Michigan State was inconsistent. Also because of the lack of depth. And we talked about this many times. And it's, this is an interesting thing to me. And I'm not saying this to toot our own horns, but we spent a lot of time last year talking about how this was not Michigan State as we've come to know it. The profile of that team, the way that they played stylistically, looked much more like a standard issue Wisconsin team than it did Michigan State. And I just did not hear very many people talking about that. And I'm going to return to that theme later because I think what I'm talking about, that lack of depth and the way that it impacted how MSU played and the success or inconsistency that they had, and why this year looks to be potentially very, very different. I think those things are being undersold. Yeah. And I don't think they're properly understood. And I get it. I can excuse people who don't cover Michigan State day in, day out, not fully appreciating how hugely important it is for a Tom Izzo team to have depth. Because more than any other coach I can think of, what he wants to do virtually requires it.
Yeah.
You know, you could sit there and say, oh, these are young kids. Why can't they play 35 minutes a night? Not how it works. Yeah. Not how it works when you want to play the way Michigan State typically does. Credit to Izzo, and I don't think he received a lot of credit for this, and he should have, for looking at his team honestly and realizing we can't do what we normally do and opting to play differently to maximize that team's chances at success. And I think in the end, you know, the standings don't say it, but I'm going to say it. They would have beaten Minnesota and they would have finished in a tie for second in the league.
Yeah.
Pretty good. They go to the Sweet 16, the only Big Ten team to get out of the first weekend. Pretty good. Given the circumstances, I think you have to give him credit for making those adjustments. And I don't think that's been properly appreciated. But look, I'm speaking for myself, but I feel safe in saying I'm speaking for just about everybody who's listening to this. We're all going to be very, very grateful that we don't have to see a rerun of that. And there's ample reason to suspect that we are going to see Michigan State getting back to the essence of what it is as a program, which I think should eliminate a lot of that inconsistency that we saw last season. That's the theory, at least. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that theory in detail.
Right.
But that's what I think. That's what I think we're looking at. And that's what I think we had last season. For better or for worse, they didn't have a lot of choice.
Yeah, and I think, you know, the other aspect of that we talked about a lot during the season, which you didn't touch on it yet, and maybe we'll later, but just briefly, one of the big changes in consistency was the play of AJ Hoggard, the point guard, which he was so important for Michigan State in executing its offense and defense, right? I mean, that's the team runs as well as the point guard is playing oftentimes. And we had a guy who if you watch the NCAA tournament, you think this guy is unbelievable. He's a first round pick. And then if you watch the Big Ten tournament, you're like, this guy's terrible. How's he even on the floor, right? I mean, that was like a week apart.
Right. And that's exactly it. It was something we said often last year and even some the year before. This team will go as AJ Hoggard goes. And when he's locked in and focused and playing the way Izzo wants him to play in terms of balancing his responsibilities in terms of making teammates better while also finding opportunities to do things himself, Michigan State is a very, very good team. They were a very, very good team last year when that AJ Hoggard was on the floor. When he wasn't, you know, they were not so good. And Michigan State, you know, there are some programs, basically anybody who runs predominantly motion offense. So Purdue would fall into that category as an example of this. Can get away with at times not having a great obvious point guard, you know, because that system doesn't lean on one guy to initiate offense, to run it the way that point guard centric offenses do. Well, Tom Izzo has always run a point guard centric system. And so his best teams tend to be the ones that have the best point guard play. I would say the only Final Four team he's had that didn't have near elite point guard play would be the 04-05 team when Drew Neitzel was a freshman, because at that stage of his career, he wasn't an elite point guard. He became a very, very good one, but he wasn't an elite guy at that point. That's the only exception to it. Pretty much maybe you could make an argument that the 2010 team, because Kalen Lucas went down with an injury, lacked it as well. But other than that, his Final Four teams have that. And AJ had not shown that consistency until they got to the tournament. It's no accident they had a very, very good tournament run in a year where AJ Hoggard made the all-regional team.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Right? So those two things dovetailed, and we're going to spend much more time talking about it. I think the same thing applies for this year. I think there is reason to suspect that he is set to have his best year ever. But the other good thing is, for the first time, I think Michigan State has a guy who can be used to keep AJ Hoggard honest.
Yep.
In other words, if he's not doing the job, he can sit on the bench and Michigan State can get high quality play even while he's out of the lineup. That is a big, big difference. Potentially a championship level difference, in my view. But again, lots of time to get into that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, just finally, the only other thing I'd say, we're talking about depth and the lack of depth that Michigan State had last year. In some ways, they had depth, but just in the wrong places, right? Like you had plenty of depth at the 5, but that's not where you really needed it last season. And you lose Hall and Aikens, your 4 and your 3 starting player, and there was no one there to fill that void, and that was the bigger problem, that you just didn't have any wing options.
Well, really, let's look at how Michigan State was lined up last season. The idea was Hall was going to be the starter at the 3, and Aikens was going to be the 6th man,
right?
Or Tyson Walker. It was kind of unclear at the beginning of the season which of those two guys would start, which one would be the first guy off the bench. But it really didn't matter much, because it was going to be largely a 6-man group was going to play the majority of the minutes. The 5 spot, I guess, a little different, but you get my drift. Yeah. When they lost Hall and Aikens, it was both guys at the 3.
Yeah, right.
That were out. So you had no choice but to do some unconventional things that really left Michigan State hurting at a key position, and they never really found a good answer for that until Aikens and Hall were back. That was the answer. They didn't find another one somewhere in their roster. So, yeah, you're right in that, 2 guys, although I would argue that the depth at 5 wasn't really depth as we usually think about it, because again, you were talking about 2 freshmen behind Mahdi.
Sure.
Those guys were learning, and they were very you couldn't count on Kohler and Cooper from game to game the way that I think you're going to be able to this year.
Right.
It was a different deal. But yeah, depth, there's just no question. Michigan State's depth, really the only guy that you could count on game in, game out for the entirety of the season to an extent was Trey Holloman. And even that was only in certain ways. Like, you knew he wasn't going to make many mistakes with the ball, and you knew he could give them something defensively. But he wasn't aggressive in looking for his own offense. So even there, it was limited. It was a very, very shallow bench by Tom Izzo standards, incredibly shallow. And so he had to do some things differently than we're used to seeing in order to navigate that.
And one of the big downfalls of someone, if you are considered a Hall of Fame coach, which he obviously is that even when you do things that are impressive, no one notices, no one cares as much. You don't get the accolades, right? Like
I think that's what I'm pointing out.
Right, there's no way Tom Izzo could get Coach of the Year in the Big Ten. I just don't see how it could possibly happen. If he wins it all this year, he's still not going to get Coach of the Year in the Big Ten. I mean, unless they go like 20-0 or something. I find it'd be pretty hard to imagine. There'll be some team that overachieves, and people say, "Wow, this guy really brought them." I'm just guessing that's generally how it goes, right? When you're a highly acclaimed coach, it's really hard to get there.
Yeah, I agree with your general sentiment there. Um, but I do think, and that's what I was kind of trying to point out, is that I don't think that got acknowledged or even understood very well by most people who cover the sport. That they didn't look at Michigan State and say, "Boy, this is a really different kind of team than we're used to seeing," and appreciate what that meant. And the fact that they were actually, look, we talk about the inconsistency, and it's all true. They were a second place team. This wasn't a disaster,
Right.
you
Yeah.
know. They did in a competitive Big Ten. They did a lot of good things, not as much as we're used to seeing, but they did a lot of good things. And then I think the tournament run sort of validated that work. That they were able to play their best basketball when they absolutely needed it most. And again, doing it in a way that is different than what we're used to seeing. And you're right, Izzo should receive more credit for that than he gets. But you know, it's also funny too. And I know we talked about this at times. We had Mike Garland on twice or
Yeah.
three
Twice.
times.
Yeah. For the Penn State
Twice.
preview and then the
Okay.
Iowa post game.
We talked to him explicitly about the offensive rebounding,
Right. Yeah.
and he denied it. Absolutely denied it. Said, no, that's not true. Believe me, they want to be better. I believe that they wanted to be better, but I know what my eyes were telling me. You're watching a game on a television screen and a Michigan State shot goes up, and you're not seeing any green and white bodies in the shot. That's not normal. You know?
Yeah.
By that, I mean, of course, they're not sending guys to the boards offensively. That's not normal. And we noticed it early, and the numbers, which we'll talk about, got into that area, and proved, demonstrating clearly that they were not not even by Michigan State standards, by average team standards, they were a poor offensive rebounding team. But I don't think it was so much that they were trying and failing. I think they made a strategic decision.
Yeah.
To not go hard to the boards, to maximize getting back.
Yeah, for sure that was happening. And you, when you're watching the broadcast, I mean, I go to the home games, so I don't get the home announcements, but at least when I watch the away games, everyone talked about Michigan State as if they were watching the Michigan State from a few years ago. Oh, they run all the time. They rebound a lot. I'm like, boy, I don't feel like they do either of those things a lot this year.
It goes to show you, man, when and this is true in life. This isn't just about Michigan State basketball, but when you have perceptions that get entrenched, and sometimes for very good reason, over a long period of time, changing them is very, very tough work. And even when the evidence is clearly in front of your face, it still is yeoman's work to try to alter perceptions. And you did see it with Michigan coverage of Michigan State last year. These guys talk as if nothing's any different than it's ever been, when it was radically different in some very important ways. If we talk about what are the core values, the staples of Tom Izzo's program, I would say the first two things I would talk about would be offensive rebounding and transition play. Those are two things that are non-negotiables for him. He emphasizes every year through various groups of players, entirely different rosters. It's always there, right? Neither of those two things were present last year at all. And how often did you hear people talk about it? Almost never. We did. And again, I'm not saying that to pat ourselves on the back. It's just, it's an illustration of the point that even broadcasters who spend time thinking about these things and preparing to do their work, national writers, I just don't feel that anybody was truly locked into what was a very significant story about Michigan State last year, that they were a radically different team.
Yeah. Well, that just goes to show that, if you're a broadcaster, you're doing 6 games a week, 5 games a week, whatever, you can't possibly know, you can't pay enough attention, watch enough game film, or I suppose you could, but it'd be pretty hard to do, to really know the intricacies of the different teams and to your point, just how things might be different than they have been in the past. And you don't just get basketball analysis on the show, you get some philosophy too. So you get some really good stuff here. So some life lessons. So let's talk about the team and the roster first. We'll go over, as we've been going with all the previews this season, we'll talk about the players lost to the team. And we'll begin with Joey Hauser, who's obviously the most significant loss for the year. There was a small chance that he would come back this season. There was some talk for a little bit that there was significant NIL money available that he might return, but he decided to head pro. The team was inconsistent, but the one guy who really wasn't was Joey Hauser. He was solid, 6'9" senior, definitely had the best career of his, best year of his career. He finished second on the team in scoring at 14.4 points a game, was number 1 in rebounding at 7 a game, shot 48, 46, and 88. Had more assists and turnovers, which is really great for playing at the 4, and actually played very passable defense. He was actually, he was not a negative out there on the defensive end. So, he's obviously a big hole that has to be filled going into this season.
Yeah, just a great way to end his career after, his first 2 seasons were struggles.
Yeah.
And especially because he was a guy who was so highly regarded coming out of high school, had a pretty good freshman year at Marquette, transferred to Michigan State, had to sit out a year. And, the expectations being so high, and we only saw glimpses of what he could be. But man, last season, as you say, the team's performance was up and down, but Joey Hauser's really wasn't. He just shot the ball hellaciously well. I think was a very good defensive rebounder, cut down on the mistakes. And I think a lot of that was due to the fact that Michigan State changed the way they utilized him. They stopped trying to force him into a playmaking role, and just kind of let him focus on scoring primarily from the perimeter on offense, not ask him to do as much. And so lo and behold, you see the turnovers decrease and his assists stayed relatively high. And as you say, he got to a point where, because I think he got his body in great shape and he just learned more through, video work and just through experience in playing, became passable defensively. He was never going to be a great defender, but he was far better than he was his first 2 seasons. So you add it all up, he was right there. It was either he or Tyson Walker was Michigan State's best and most consistent player last season. And I feel great for him that he was able to go out on a high note, playing very, very well, very consistently. And I know he's with Utah. I'm not sure where he stands in terms of, I would assume he'll probably do a G League stint this year, but I think the fact that he's played pro basketball and has a chance to carve out an NBA career for himself is fantastic. And it was good for him. And his loss definitely creates a hole. And the major area it hurts is an obvious one. It's perimeter shooting, right?
Yeah.
46% from 3 from the 4 spot
on high volume
at decent volume. Yeah. Those guys don't grow on trees. And it is a truism that Tom Izzo teams tend to be, and this goes back way before the modern emphasis on finding stretch 4s. Izzo's always wanted stretch 4s. He had them, AJ Granger was a stretch 4, long before that came into vogue. So ideally, he wants a 4-man who can be a threat from 3, because it makes your spacing better. Mm-hmm. It stretches the defense, which should create other opportunities, particularly for this Michigan State team that has some real dynamism at the guard spots. A stretched defense is going to create better opportunities for them in theory. And so replacing that is a hard task. I don't think Michigan State will completely replace the numbers or the efficiency. That's a tall order, you know.
Yeah.
I do think they've got reason to hope that they can do well enough, but the fact is, losing Joey Hauser is a real loss in that area in particular. You know.
Yep. And I guess I just want to point out one last time. I know I mentioned a few times during the season, but of all the people who were, at least in Michigan State's roster, who were affected by COVID, Joey Hauser, at least from reports, and he clearly was someone who was really bothered by this. And if you have any young adults who are going through college or, at this time, or even high school kids, you'll notice the level of depression, anxiety, those sorts of things really got a lot worse during COVID. For whatever reason.
No question.
And
no question.
My wife's a pediatrician, and there's no doubt it's gotten a lot worse. And so he really struggled with that. And so it's a really great credit that he's managed to overcome those things. And anyway, it was great. It's a great finish to his career, but I think I think we don't recognize that may have played as much a role as anything else, basketball things, the fact that he just
absolutely
those things.
And he, and something that's credit to him is that he was relatively open about that too, which is a hard thing for anybody to admit that, they were bothered, they were affected by things like that psychologically. That's not often an easy thing for people to be candid about. And he was, and the fact that he was able to overcome that is fantastic for him. It was very, very important for Michigan State basketball. And again, now he's kind of on track to hopefully have a bright future in basketball as a career, wherever it takes him.
Yeah, we definitely saw that problem, like with Patrick McCaffrey's a good example of that too, right? That I think probably affected him as well at Iowa. All right, so again, not many players lost to this team, which is a credit to Izzo and his staff, and the fact that they are very much unlike most of the basketball world. The second departure was Pierre Brooks, and 6'6" Brooks, plenty of opportunities, right? This is if there was ever a chance to really work your way into rotation to get minutes, this was it. He had multiple injuries at his position, and yet he only averaged 3.6 points a game, 1.7 rebounds a game, played 30 times, but shot 33, 32, and 60, and ended up transferring to Butler to restart his career. And I think, one of the big things with him too was the fact that his conditioning just did not seem great, and that he seemed to move less well as the season went along than at the start.
That's really it. I think that impacted what his ceiling was defensively in a pretty profound way. And we know this. Everybody knows it. If you can't defend, you're not going to play at Michigan State. That is just the bottom line.
Right.
Better players than Pierre Brooks have seen that happen to them. I look at somebody like Nick Ward. Nick Ward, and granted injuries played a role in it too, blah, blah, blah. But the fact is, Nick Ward's junior year, his last year in the program, his role was decreasing, primarily because Michigan State was better overall when they were better defensively with Xavier Tillman and Kenny Goins as the starting point or starting posts. And that's Nick Ward. We're talking about a guy who unquestionably was a great, gifted low post scorer, a very good rebounder at both ends, a guy who had real strengths in his game, but because of the negatives defensively, his role was decreasing over time. Pierre, I feel badly, and I think it's unfortunate that it didn't work out, because I really liked Pierre coming out of high school. I saw his first game in high school. I went out specifically to see him because I thought he was a guy Michigan State would be interested in. And they were, and they recruited him hard. They signed him. There's a lot of reason to be enthusiastic about him, but I think the conditioning part and probably also the, and we can never really speak to this. You only go by what you see on the floor, but, I have to assume that maybe he wasn't quite as good in terms of his attention to detail in the film room, so to speak.
Yeah.
Because that's an area that's also very, very important for guys who make strides at Michigan State. You can look at guys like Travis Trice, Denzel Valentine, who were not gifted athletes. So they had to find, even when they got into better condition, they were never going to. Joey Hauser, the good example we were just talking about, got himself into better condition, but I think it was also evidence that he put the time in the film room to get better. And sometimes by doing that, by being able to know what an opponent's going to do, to anticipate things, you can give yourself shortcuts that can make up sometimes for a lack of premium athleticism.
Absolutely.
You know, that's the theory, at least. So it just never came together for Pierre. And then as the season wore on, I think it even started impacting the lack of confidence, the lack of steady minutes impacted the lack of confidence. And that in turn took a toll on what was always his greatest strength, which was his ability to shoot. That declined as well. And so by the end of the year, you couldn't even really count on him for that. So it's unfortunate it didn't work out. I really liked him. I think he was a very good student. He's a player who does have certain gifts and talent, and I'm hoping for his sake that he's able to put it together at Butler and have a strong end to his career. But it just didn't happen at Michigan State. The reality from an MSU perspective, strictly in a basketball sense, is that losing him really doesn't create there's not the impact that, say, losing a Joey Hauser creates. Yeah. You're not really having to replace very much.
Yeah. And we even thought this before the season began, that if he didn't emerge as a viable option at that position, that he would really struggle to find a way into rotation this year with the freshman coming in.
Handwriting was on the wall.
Yeah.
I mean, with the way they recruited, what they were bringing in, the number of guys they were bringing back, it was very obvious to see this coming, that last season, and it's crazy in some ways, a stark illustration of the realities of the sport now, that a guy who was just beginning his sophomore year, we could see it this time last year, that, hey, this is a fork in the road for Pierre Brooks and his career at MSU. And he only had one season under his belt.
I know.
But that's where we were. And sure enough, that proved to be true.
Well, in an unusual twist of fate, or something that seems to happen a lot, he will be returning to the Breslin Center this season with his Bulldogs in an early non-conference matchup, which we'll talk about later when we come closer to the game. So final player loss is Jason Whitens, 6'5" Western Michigan transfer who had an unfortunate ACL injury in the first exhibition game before last season. Came back, was healthy, and played this year. Got into 19 games, was very instrumental in the win against Portland. He chipped in with 4 points, 2 boards, but never really, because of the return of Hall and Akins, even in limited capacity, he never really saw much of a role going forward.
I thought he might play a little more than he did. I think that in the end, the fact that he really wasn't a tremendously confident offensive player limited how much he could do. But he will always have that game against Portland where he got, I believe both of those rebounds were offensive, if I remember correctly. Yep.
I think you're right.
Something MSU didn't get a lot of last year's team, as we were talking about. He made big contributions to enable them to get a win, and what would have been a very bad loss had they lost it. So he did contribute. Glad for his sake. Really, the biggest thing is that he battled back from that injury and was able to have his season, played for a high major program that had some success. So I feel glad for him in that respect, for sure.
And I only briefly met him, and he seemed like a really nice kid when I spoke to him for a few minutes after the Ohio State game. All right, so before we go to the returning players, I'd like to remind you of our longtime sponsor of the show, Nudge Printing. Nudge Printing, run by Gabe and Brittany, fantastic Spartan fans. They set up their own print company in Portland, Michigan. So all the products you purchase from Nudge Printing are made here in Michigan. They have a huge selection of Spartan apparel. You can head on over to nudgeprinting.com to see their selection. They also have other schools besides just Spartans. So if you want something from Eastern Michigan or Central Michigan, Western Michigan, Hope College, Alma, you can head on over to Nudge Printing. It's likely if it's a school in Michigan outside of the Wolverines, you're going to be able to find something from Nudge Printing. They also have a few other random schools in the country. You can find stuff like Texas State or other schools. I have a bunch of Nudge Printing stuff. I know Rod does. It's fantastic stuff, super comfortable. I have a hoodie. I have a t-shirt, very comfortable, very wearable. I use both of those to win the free throw competition, to win a trip or two to the Final Four. So they are very functional. It's very handy. You can't go wrong if you order Nudge Printing stuff. I can't recommend that the product's enough. I have a decal on my computer as well. So everything they make is really high quality, great people. They're very instrumental in the Spartan Strong effort after the shooting on campus at Michigan State. They raised over $100,000. I can't remember now how many t-shirts they printed, but it was a lot. And so they also have vintage stuff. So if you want some vintage Spartan gear, like, logos from the 60s or 70s in football, they all that cool stuff that you can't get elsewhere. And so they're one of the few licensed providers of lots of those logos that from Michigan State. So outside of Nike or something like that. So check them out, nudgeprinting.com. And as a listener to the show, Christmas is coming up a little bit. You get 20% off your order if you go to, if you type Final Four, it's one word, into the coupon code at checkout on your order. You can also get our gear, both our hoodie or our t-shirt, at the Final Fours on the schedule.com/merchandise. And they're to link you directly to Nudge Printing. You get the same discount if you want. You can get our stuff, and then you can order more than just our logo stuff. So check it out at nudgeprinting.com. You'll be glad you did. Before we go into returning players, I just want to tell a brief little story, which I didn't tell Rod about this beforehand, but my wife was talking to her hairdresser here in Grand Rapids, who was at a tailgate with Steven Izzo and his girlfriend and a couple other people and stuff. And she was talking to my wife. She said, yeah, I think Steven Izzo said he's gotten a lot better this year, and he's expecting to start. He's really improved it. My wife's like, no, I don't think he is. I think he was joking.
Huh. Yeah, that would be news.
Yeah, I think, and I'm sure he'd feel really bad thinking that there's actually someone there who thought he really was going to start, because she's like, yeah, he seemed really short. I was surprised that he'd be a starting basketball player at Michigan State, since I don't think he's quite 5'9", although I think that's what he's listed at. But we're not going to talk about the Walkers. We're going to talk about returning players from Michigan State. We'll start with Tyson Walker. And as an aside here too, this is the last year that if you're actually listed as a senior, that you actually can come back with a COVID year. Now, that would not be the case for Tyson Walker, since this is his COVID year. But so things will make a lot more sense when we talk about players next year. If you're actually a senior, you're a senior, et cetera. So Tyson Walker, 6'1" senior guard, came back for his COVID year. Third year in East Lansing after being at Northeastern to begin his career. And he ended up as the top scorer for Michigan State, averaging 14.8 points a game on 46, 42, and 80 shooting. He was that aggressiveness that we had hoped he'd be the year before, that he wasn't quite. He was a real pest on defense, great secondary score playmaker, had almost 100 assists for the season and a better than 2-to-1 assist turnover ratio. He's all the accolades you want to shower on Tyson Walker. They're all deserved. And he is a huge re-addition to the team going forward this season.
Yeah, look, if Tyson Walker and Malik Hall had not opted to take their COVID year and return, we would not be talking about Michigan State in quite the same fashion that we are. That's an understatement, right?
Yeah, right.
In Tyson Walker, you are talking about, I think, the best offensive perimeter player in the Big Ten in terms of everything he can do to score the basketball. And it's funny. If you go back to when he was brought in from Northeastern as a portal addition, at that point, the idea was, coming off that 2021 season where Michigan State had so much trouble at the point.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. This guy's being brought in to solve the point guard spot. And he did play a lot of point his first year at MSU. But over time, AJ Hoggard started to gain more trust, get better, which enabled MSU last season to primarily use Tyson as an off-ball player, to focus on scoring and defending.
Yeah.
And playmaking was still there, but it was a secondary element to what was being asked of him. And I think that's only going to be even more the case this season because Michigan State has even more depth at the point. But it's a hell of a thing, and it's a very nice element to have on your roster when your off-ball guys have as much ability to handle and create as Tyson Walker has.
Yeah.
It makes Michigan State, and this is a trend that we've seen in the college game in recent years, that, you know, you think back to teams, maybe not as much UConn, but teams like Baylor, multiple guys at the same time with point guard skills. And that's what Tom Izzo has. And Tyson Walker's a huge part of that. Obviously, he's proven to be an outstanding perimeter shooter, and they're going to need that kind of production from him again this season. But that's not all he is. I think what made a big difference for him last season was how much better he was finishing around the basket. His first season, he struggled a lot with Big Ten size and physicality to finish plays that his speed would enable him to make, right? He's so quick. He's able to get by people and get to the basket, but then the next step is, can you finish when you get there? Because you will usually meet resistance. And last season, I think he was stronger. That enabled him more confident. That enabled him to be much better finishing those plays. So, you know, he's getting consistent first team All Big Ten preseason recognition, some level of All-America recognition even, which is outstanding. And I think he's good enough, experienced enough, and level-headed enough to likely make good on all of that. So he's a weapon. There's no doubt about that.
I guess the real question I have with him returning this season is did he hit his ceiling? Is there going to be more that we're going to see from him? Do you think his shooting will be even better? Do you think he's going to be able to more dynamic scoring? How do you see him as a different role this season as last? Besides, I mean, you mentioned that he's going to shoot more, probably less on the ball, but
you know, you can always shoot a little better. I mean, what was he, 41% from three? It's really good, but
42.
Could he,
Mm-hmm.
You know, could he? It was a higher percentage, I believe, his first year on lower volume. You know, it's a good point because he solved a lot of the problems he had in his first year, which primarily came down to confidence and aggressiveness. You know, we spent a lot of time his first year talking about that boy, he just has to shoot. He's a good shooter. He has to be willing to take shots. He has to be willing to try to make plays. Well, that all got solved last year. By the end of the season, he was an extremely confident and aggressive player. So I don't know that I expect it to go up a level there. I think you just, you know, you're talking about more marginal improvements, just a little more consistent. You know, but let's put it this way. If somebody said to me right now, would you take a complete rerun of his junior year and run with it? If I gave it to you right now, I would say yes. I would take exactly the same player. I think he's capable of even being a little bit better, but I don't think you're going to see, you know, Tyson Walker is not suddenly 6'6".
Right,
so the things that he doesn't do, like rebounding, he's not really ever going to be a great factor as a rebounder. He's probably not going to shoot 70% from three. You know, those things aren't realistic. So in terms of what he can be, I think we know what he can be. And in turn, they're not suddenly asking more of him. They're not saying, okay, we lost AJ Hogard, you got to run the ship. No, they're not asking that. So I think there could always be improvement, but it will likely be, if it happens, it would likely be more at the margins than anything else.
Yeah, I almost wonder if he has the same scoring as last year, but he's more efficient in some ways of doing it.
That could be
right. And he
can even score a little less.
Sure. Yeah.
Because, you know, minutes, but you know, it's something that we're going to talk about here. Michigan State's improved depth should mean that everybody is playing a little bit less among these returning starters than they did a year ago. So is that going to mean maybe he only scores 13 a night, but he's a better player? Yeah, it could be.
I almost wonder too. We saw it a number of games. We saw even the first year he was with Michigan State, but more last year, that killer instinct that he has at the end of the game where, he wants the ball. And I wonder if we see that a little bit more this year. That would be the one other big difference too, that potentially you could see in his game.
Although I think that's why I said by the end.
You're right. By the end, he's kind of
I don't know if you could have said it in November.
Yeah.
By February, March, I think he was very confident in those situations.
All right. So now we'll go to the enigma, AJ Hoggard. Plenty of preseason recognition for this point guard, 6'4" senior guard, averaged 12.9 points a game and almost 6 assists a game. He still is well over 2-to-1 assist to turnover ratio, shot 42, 33, and 80, which was actually a significant improvement over his previous season, especially at the line. That's where you really noticed the biggest change, at the free throw line. And as we mentioned, I don't know, every game last year, and we already started this show, when he's locked in, he is a really tough and difficult cover. When he's not, he's he can be not a liability, but he's not a plus addition out there on the floor. So, what AJ you get, I guess, is going to dictate, how the season goes for him, and maybe Michigan State as well.
Yeah, and I alluded to this a few minutes ago. The same rule still applies, that as AJ Hoggard goes, so goes Michigan State, with one caveat to that. The two things, I think, Trey Holloman having another year under his belt, but maybe even more so, the arrival of Jeremy Fears. There's just no reason to live with the unfocused AJ Hoggard. They've got other answers, which is a big difference. Now, I happen to think that everything sets up well for not having to confront that very often, because I think AJ has come to finally and conclusively understand who he has to be. He's gotten himself in great shape by all accounts. People who saw him over the offseason could see it. He also, and this didn't maybe get as much attention in Michigan State circles as I think it merited. He went to the Chris Paul camp for guards, and there were some NBA scouts watching, the counselors, which are the college guys who were brought in to kind of run that, but they do their own stuff too. And AJ got a lot of positive talk coming out of that camp. So I think he finally understands what is required of him. And this is a process that point guards go through at Michigan State. Jeremy Fear is going to go through it too. But some guys get it quicker than others. In AJ's case, I think he mostly got it last season, but there were enough bad moments that you had to wonder. And then at the end, in that 3-game run of the tournament, he really played like the best version of himself, I think, that's possible. And that means, I think it's decision making. It's having the mentality to understand that your first job is to make everybody else better and then get your own, and that's a hard balancing act for a lot of guys to walk, depending upon how they're wired. And for AJ, that's been difficult, but I think he's finally figured it out. It should be noted too that from the moment he got on campus, the big obvious weakness in his offensive game was the jump shooting. Last season, he shot 33% from 3. That's good enough, honestly. I think I see a lot of people talking about, well, the last step he has to take is to become a better 3-point shooter. That would be great if it happened. And there's reason to think that it might, because he shot very well by all accounts all summer long, and he's put in time on that part of his game. So I'm not discounting that it could happen. And if it does, it makes him better still. What I am saying is, if he shoots only as well as he did last season from 3, I think that's good enough. Mm-hmm. Because he was good enough at 33% to force defenses to account for him, which is all he really needs. Because when that happens, that opens up his ability to get to the rim. And that's where we know AJ is at his best, is getting to the basket, finishing, drawing fouls. He's gotten to be a very good free throw shooter. He was around 80% last
80%,
year.
Yep.
Big step up. And for a guy who draws contact the way he does, that's huge. So, I guess my point there is I would take what we got from AJ as a jump shooter last year. If he can be better, hey, that's fantastic. You take that. Yeah. But I don't think it's necessary for him to be better. I think what makes him better this year is just continued focus and understanding of the balance the line he's got to walk to make his team play at its best.
I was at the Big Ten tournament, so I did not see this, but people who were watching that on television, the Michigan State's game against Ohio State, there was a long stretch where he sits on the bench and looks sullen and sulky and, by Tom Izzo, where Izzo's talking to him, we'll just say. I think that really epitomizes the relationship Izzo has with the point guards and what's impressive is the response, right? I think, people criticize Izzo and they're worried about, AJ leaving, all kinds of things, right, come out of that. And you saw a response, a guy who looked the best he had all season right after that, the NCAA tournament. I think that just shows the depth of relationship that the coach has with his players and the way they respond. And, I think Izzo is kind of a master in many ways. He's proven through the years that of how he can get the most from players, maybe even, sometimes when they don't think they can do it themselves or when they don't, think there's a problem. And so I'm very hopeful that that whatever it was is maybe totally worked itself out.
Well, again, AJ saw the difference when he's engaged, when he's locked in, as he was in those 3 tournament games. It's a different deal. It's a different deal for him. It's a different deal for his team. When he's not, you see results like they saw in that Big Ten tournament game against Ohio State. So it's all there. But when you listen to Izzo over this offseason talk about the way his veterans have handled things, well, AJ's part of that. And so I think there is I don't think, I've heard this. There is a level of confidence in terms of where his mentality is at that has not been there before. So we'll hope that is all borne out.
Well, moving on, we'll go to Jaden Akins, 6'3" junior, had a rough start to the season because he started out injured, and it took all year, like you mentioned before, for him really to come back to where he was, because in the summer, and people who watched Moneyball definitely saw a different Jaden than they had seen during his freshman year. He ended up averaging 9.8 points a game, 4 rebounds a game, shot 42, 42, and 71. So really solid spot up shooter, sound defender on the wing. And there was definitely definite talk about him leaving the program and going somewhere else. But he talked to the coaching team, the staff, and they worked out whatever they had to work out as far as assuring him, I think, that the opportunities that he needed in order to advance to the next stage of his career would be found at Michigan State. And so it's going to be great seeing him. He has changed his body. If those who watch Moneyball, he looked different than he had before. He definitely has gotten stronger and bigger. So I think it's a lot of expectations for his role to be similar to last year in the sense that he's going to be relied upon for his outside shooting, but also the expectation that he's going to be doing more inside too, right?
Yeah, just to play more with the ball in his hands. We talked about it here some, and there was a segment of the fan base that just found it impossible to understand, but I think as to why this would be the case, but there was a reality to the possibility of his leaving. And it wasn't that he had discord with Izzo, and it wasn't that he hated Michigan State or didn't get along with his teammates. None of that stuff was true. But you have to understand with guys that are playing at a program like Michigan State, and they are, starters, playing heavy minutes, those types of things. Every one of those guys thinks about the NBA. They all do.
Yeah. That's why you go to Michigan State.
And right. And in Jaden Akins' case, there was a feeling for him and some of those around him that, his interests beyond Michigan State weren't being served because he was essentially limited in his role in the offense as a spot up shooter, which was true. If you watched how Michigan State played last year, that's what Jaden did. And the feeling is, well, look, he's 6'3", so he's not 6'7", so he's going to have to be able to demonstrate for his pro prospects that he can play with the ball in his hands, that he can play pick and roll basketball, that he can initiate offense, he can do those things. And so there was a legitimate question. Are those interests being served? Are they going to be served by another year at Michigan State? And so my understanding, and both of these guys, both Izzo and Jaden, have talked about it recently within the last couple of weeks. They acknowledged that everything that we said was going on was going on. And there were discussions between those two parties, and there was a meeting of the minds. And essentially what Izzo says happened is he felt last year Jaden wasn't trustworthy enough in those situations, so that he had some work to do in order to demonstrate that he was worthy of that trust, but that Izzo would give him that opportunity. And for his part, that was sufficient for Jaden. And I fully expect we are going to see much more of the ball in Jaden's hands, using him as the initiator in pick and roll offense, somewhat similarly to the way Michigan State used Tyson Walker.
Right.
So I think we're going to see all three of those guards playing with the ball in their hands a lot, rather than primarily two guys and then Jaden as a spot up guy. They're still going to spot up Jaden. I mean, when he shoots 40-some% from three, so. You have to take advantage of that, right? But I think you're going to see him. I think you're going to see him play maybe a little bit more the way we saw Tyson Walker play, where he will do some one-on-one stuff. He will get involved in pick and roll stuff where it's really primarily designed for him to get shot opportunities. I hope that we see Jaden going to the basket with a lot more frequency, because I felt that's something that his physical tools should allow him to do at a very high level. And in my mind, we haven't seen nearly enough of it. I mean, in the pre-Cohen Carr era, he was Michigan State's best athlete.
Right.
And he's a very good athlete. And now that he's, as you were alluding to, he's improved his strength. He's gotten a little stronger, a little bigger. That should make him nothing but more effective getting to the basket and finishing plays. So that's what I want to see. The other thing about him, well, two other things. I think there is another level for him to unlock as a rebounder, especially offensively. And if you're talking about Michigan State getting back to being Michigan State on the boards, that almost always comes down to how good the perimeter group is, because the front court guys are the front court guys. And I think Michigan State's big men were solid rebounders last year. I don't think there were problems there. It's that the wings haven't been as good as we've seen at other times. There's no reason why Jaden Akins can't be a very good rebounder. None. And now that he's stronger, I'll double down on that. The other thing that he brings is Jaden Akins has the potential to be an outstanding defensive player. And we've seen lots of evidence of that over his first two seasons. I think that will continue. And you put these three starting guards together that we've just concluded talking about, defensively, that is as good a group as Michigan State's had in a while. All three guys can be plus defenders. And that's usually not the case. Usually, like, the Cassius era, we talk about, well, Cassius just got to be functional.
Right.
We weren't talking about him as a guy who could lock people down ever. All three of these guys can lock people down.
Well, next we'll talk about Blake Hall. So he also had a decision to make this year, and he decided to return for his COVID year. He's coming back after, I guess the only way to describe it is a disappointing season for him, and which was plagued by injuries. We talked about it, and I think it's easy to forget because it was so early in the season. It was only a couple of games, but he was Michigan State's best player on the offensive and defensive end. I mean, if you remember that overtime game against Kentucky, he had two game tying buckets in overtime and in regulation, and he was instrumental for that victory. He averaged 8.9 points a game, had 4.3 rebounds a game, shot 44, 33, and 87. It was down for his 3-point shooting, but I mean, that was for sure related at least partially to the fact that he had the injury in his foot. So he is back. He is healthy by all accounts. He's still getting up to speed, but close. And so our expectation, I think by the time the season starts, he'll be pretty much 100% or about as close as you can get.
They say he's 100% now. Izzo said he's the best physically he's been since his sophomore year. So that's really good news. I think it's health, you know. If Malik Hall is healthy, he can be an outstanding player. And I understand why he's not getting any preseason attention for all Big Ten teams, et cetera. I get it. I feel like Jaden Akins isn't getting enough in that regard, but Malik Hall definitely isn't. But if Malik Hall's at his best, he is an all Big Ten caliber player. We've seen it. I know people want to talk about inconsistency, and I get that. But, you know, last year, I kind of write off in that regard from him because from the Villanova game on, he was never straight physically. So you saw what it took away from him. Now he's back. He's feeling good. He's a fifth-year player, so he's seen a lot. He's gone through a lot. And they're going to ask, I think, a little less of him. I mean, there's still some talk that maybe in certain lineup situations you might see him on the wing, but I honestly don't think we're going to see that very much. I think he's primarily going to be a 4. I think that's his most natural position. I thought he looked good at the 3 for the brief time he was healthy last year. I think he was capable of doing it, but, you know, it didn't work out that way. I think now it'll be a little easier on him. They really need him. I mean, they need him to be the shooter that he was prior to the injury last season from 3, because as we talked about, that's one big thing that this team is missing with Joey Hauser's departure. Malik's never going to be Joey. He's not that kind of player. I don't think he'll shoot that kind of volume. But if he can be efficient as a trail guy in transition or secondary breaks, I think he's shown an ability to do that. He can be good coming off, occasionally off catch and shoots, off kickouts, especially, I think will be there for him. And yet he can also add some things inside the arc. He's a very crafty player at times with the ball, kind of maneuvering himself into good scoring positions. So I think he's headed, health permitting, I think he's headed for a very, very good senior year. And he's a critical player for MSU.
Without a doubt. So then we go to another senior, Mady Sissoko, 6'9" senior. He definitely had a big coming out party early in the season against Kentucky and Gonzaga. And then that level of production didn't quite keep up. And so, you know, according to Mike Garland, who we talked to, he said, well, you know, people watch some film. They realize what he can do. Right. And they decided we're going to take that away.
Those rim dives aren't as readily available.
Right. And I think there's no question with a guy who's had as limited sort of basketball experience compared to lots of players, that he just looks like the game itself. He doesn't quite, it's not as instinctive as it is for other players who've been playing since, you know, they're 4 or something. He ended up averaging 5.1 points a game and 6.1 rebounds a game, led the Michigan State with almost a block a game. And if anyone's transformed their body, it is, I mean, there have been a lot of players who have, but he looks a lot bigger.
That's crazy.
25 pounds in his chest or something. I mean, it's like, he is really big.
You would have thought, well, Mady Sissoko was built like a brick house.
Yeah, before.
Anyway.
Yeah.
So who would have thought that kind of transformation would be in the cards? But it's obvious when you see him. Yeah. Look, I think he had a pretty good year. You know,
compared to what people were expecting, right? They're expecting him to foul out all the time, to not even stay on the court. Because it was this,
right. That's a good point. He never really struggled with foul trouble, which was a big, big improvement. He was able to play the minutes he did while avoiding fouls. He was their most reliable defender. I think was good and sometimes very good in pick and roll defense, and decent in the post. I think that increased strength might help him be even a little better down on the blocks. Respectable, solid rebounder. And a guy who could be a threat on putbacks, lobs. He could do enough to force defenses to have to play him, honestly. There is some word that he's gotten to another level of consistency in his low post game. I still don't expect that we're going to see MSU just look to throw the ball down to him a lot, but it could happen more than we've seen and maybe with better results. I just think he's a guy who gives you enough in the areas Izzo wants defensively and as a rebounder that he's going to play a significant role again. And I think he'll be good in that role.
Yeah. And I think, we've had a couple interviews with him, and I'd encourage you, if you've not had an opportunity to listen to those, just look him up. One was, I think, in February. We talked about the NIL and what he's done as far as, trying to help his family, his village back in Mali. I mean, as far as a human being, he's exceptional. And I've met him once, and he's really, he's the gentle giant, I think, is probably a good way of putting it.
True for him. And really that's something about this team. And Izzo's talked a lot about it. I saw tape of him. We're recording this on Big Ten Media Day, and I saw some clips of him this morning talking about this. Everybody talks about family, everybody talks about chemistry, and that's true. But he said it's real with this team, and they are. We've had the good fortune to talk to a number of these guys on the podcast, and to a man, everybody we've spent time with has just handled themselves extremely well, come across as great individuals. Madi, no exception to that, but he's not alone. I think it's an easy group to root for and to get behind in that way.
Yeah. So we'll keep going on the 5 position. We'll go to Jackson Kohler, although maybe a little 4 position, right? So Jackson, 6'9" sophomore, up and down season as you expect from a freshman. He learning to cope with size and strength of the league. He averaged 3 points a game, 2.9 rebounds a game, and 11 minutes a game. He shot 51% from the floor, 25% from a very limited volume at the line. And he has done the opposite. He has gotten a lot slimmer. He looks very different than he did before. And the thing he struggled with most was obviously on defense. He just not anticipating and just having schooled very often, I guess, at the 4 is probably a good way of putting it. But the word is that he's improved that a lot. And so I guess we'll see.
Yeah. I'm still skeptical of him at the 4, mostly because that's more challenging in some ways, physically at least, than the 5. Right. And I haven't seen him master the 5 yet. So, but I understand it from an offensive point of view, because Jackson, even though he was 0 for 2 on threes last year, he does have the ability to shoot. We did see it occasionally in the mid-range, right?
Yep.
There were moments where he hit some mid-range
jumpers.
He can extend out to the 3. So I get it offensively. His transformation physically leaves him looking a lot more like, say, Joey Hauser.
Yes.
And I think that's going to be good for him. I think the biggest way it's going to be good for him is, I just felt, sometimes these guys, Jackson Kohler, I think everything I've heard about him is that he's an extremely hard worker. But I think you have to go through a year before you understand just what hard work really is. So I don't blame him at all. I just think you have to experience it. And I think his conditioning last season contributed not only to issues on the defensive end, but also many, many times last year, you would see Jackson make a great post move and then be unable to finish a play at the rim. And it wasn't a strength issue. I think it was that he was running out of gas a lot of times. I don't expect that to be a problem. And so I think that his conditioning and hopefully a little bit of increased quickness as a result should make him more productive in low post. He's the one guy that MSU has that you could see, hey, if the circumstances are right, that's a guy you can see them looking to just dump the ball down to and letting him work. I don't think he's going to see the minutes to make a massive impact in that way, but I think he can help. And I think he's got a knack as an offensive rebounder. I think there's more to unlock there. And if he can be better defensively, look, he's going to be in the rotation. Izzo's already said it. All 3 of these guys are going to play again. And so I don't know that I expect their numbers to take huge jumps, but what I think we will see is just more consistent play from all of them. And Jackson would be in that group.
Yeah, I think you just definitely see more efficiency. And I imagine at the 4 spot, you're going to see that situationally dependent, either
Sure.
foul issues or injuries or a matchup dependent, where you feel like, okay, we can put him out there against their 4.
Yep.
So we'll talk about the third center, Carson Cooper, 6'11", former soccer player, and he added a bunch of weight, 25 pounds to his chest. And so he's very athletic. Obviously he's got size. And he would, as the season progressed, he definitely saw a larger role as he moved on, even through the NCAA tournament. He finished with 6 points and 4 boards against USC, and seemed to understand things better than probably, at least it seemed like he had a better feel for where he was supposed to be defensively, and was not as much as a liability as you oftentimes see with freshmen.
Well, it's that, and also his athleticism helps him as well. I think it's both of those things. Look, I like all 3 of these guys, but the more last season went along, the more convinced I became that the guy with the highest upside in that group is probably Carson Cooper. And it's because he has that combination of size and athletic ability that you don't see often. And I just think that gives him a leg up in terms of what he could be. He desperately needed to add strength, and by all accounts, he did that this offseason. I shout out to, we haven't really talked about it very much here, but MSU made a change in their strength and conditioning program, bringing in Lorenzo Guess, who, of course, people remember as a defensive back on the Nick Saban era on the football team. But Lorenzo Guess was also a high-level basketball player, had played a little bit at Michigan State.
Mm-hmm.
Could have been a high major D1 basketball player if he'd opted to go that route full time. But he has come in to run the strength and conditioning program. And all these guys were talking about having made noticeable physical changes to their body. First and foremost, the credit goes to them for putting in the work.
Yeah, they're the ones lifting the weights.
But I also think you gotta feel like Lorenzo Guess is having an impact. And Carson Cooper would be another example of that, getting stronger. If you were to tell me of this threesome that one guy would start to separate himself this year, and I had to put my money on which guy that would be, I would put my money on Carson Cooper. That doesn't mean he will, and that doesn't mean the other 2 guys aren't fully capable of having outstanding seasons, because I think they're all going to contribute. But Carson is the guy that just seems to have the elements that lead to success at a place like Michigan State. I actually, toward the end of last season, I started seeing things that reminded me that this comparison probably isn't going to strike very many people as obvious, but it's what struck me. I see a lot of Xavier Tillman in him. Like X wasn't really a guy with great low post game, but he was so reliable defensively. He was a good rebounder. He knew where to be at all times, and his athleticism still allowed him, even without a great low post game, to make an impact offensively, because he was able to rim run in transition. He was lethal in pick and roll. And Carson Cooper, if you remember that USC game, he did some things in pick and roll as as a rim diver, as a lob recipient. That were very impressive. And then you add in the fact that he's 6'11".
Yeah.
There's a lot to like.
This is why he had 100 high major offers, right?
Yeah, well, that's another one.
It drives you crazy, right?
We covered in our we have talked about it before, and I asked him what he thought, and he had some good answers, but it still doesn't make any sense to me, because you look at him, you look at the physical package, and his his obvious attitude, and it just doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah. And we're referring to the fact that he did not have many offers for this. You didn't catch up on the sarcasm there. And if you want to listen to, we talked to Carson Cooper about a month or 2 ago or so. You can check up back in the archives there and take a listen to it. He's a really cool guy. And smart. And, as you mentioned, all these guys are really easy to talk to, and they all have the same, you can definitely see why they all get along really well. And all these 3-5s, before we go on to talk about Trey, is we're talking about, diving to the rim and stuff. We're talking about the half court. We didn't see much as far as fast court, which is where you typically see all this production from the 5 spot at Michigan State. Xavier Tillman was one of that. And then that is what has me most excited about this position, I think, going to next year, because you expect that we're going to have a lot more of those opportunities for those guys to really showcase their skills and their ability to get some easy buckets on the transition. So finally, moving on to the last player returning is Trey Holloman, 6'2", a sophomore. He averaged 9 minutes a game last year, playing backup point guard to AJ Hogarth. He scored only 1.3 points a game on 39, 23, and 60 shooting, but had an almost 3-to-1 assist to turnover ratio. So a guy who did not make mistakes. Also, as my son described him, as the safe, because he locks you down. He's very good defensive potential. And at least watching Moneyball, his shot looks pretty good. He definitely looks far more comfortable and confident in what he's doing. So I think we're going to see a different Trey. And I think they've alluded to the fact that he may not just be playing on the point, on the ball. He might be off ball too.
I actually think that's going to happen a lot. Look, there's some things to really like about him. First of all, he's a competitor. That was obvious from the moment he got on campus. So you like that. The defensive potential. This is a 6'2" guard with a 6'8" wingspan. That's plus wingspan. Right. It's a good question. But that is part of the reason why you're excited about him and his potential as a defender. I think he did a good job running the offense as the backup. I think he may be on ball a little less this year, but still probably from time to time will be. That's a positive. I think the biggest thing for him is just increased aggressiveness, increased confidence in his shot. His shot looks good to me. He didn't get quite the results you'd like as a jump shooter, but I think the potential's there. So I think he's just got to be willing to take those opportunities when they come. But Izzo has mentioned he was maybe the most consistent guy they had over the summer, which is, again, a really good sign. And I definitely think he's going to play a role. It remains to be seen how many minutes he sees, but I think the opportunities are going to be there for him.
Yeah, and he is oftentimes, at least when you look at the discussion for next season, he's a forgotten player. Like, he's the one people feel like is not going to see much. And I think they're going to be surprised.
I do too.
How much more he plays than he did last year, even, because I think people just see, well, he's not the backup point guard, but I think, to your point, I think he's going to have an expanded role on the team, and it's probably dependent on how aggressive he is, like you said.
They want to, if they play the way they want to play, there's a role for Trey Holloman on this team out of necessity, because if they do the things they want to do, it's going to mean you've got to play guys off the bench.
Yeah. Well, before we go talk about the newcomers to the team, just a reminder, if you have gutter work, it is fall, it's leaf season. And if you're like me and you hate ladders or hate getting up on ladders, or you don't like heights like me, there's no better place to call than the brothers that just do gutters to take care of your leaf problem. They put leaf guards on. Now I just want to watch the leaves just blow off my roof. It's so much better than getting up on a ladder and grabbing the leaves and all the water and all the grossness that's in the gutters. Also, the ones I had that were 3 stories up, not getting a ladder for those. So I had to always hire someone to come out and do that. So it's so much better not having a water pool by the side of my house. And I'm sure there are a lot of you listening who have problems with your gutters too, and you just have not taken care of it. So these guys do a great job. They take care of it. They're efficient. They're relatively inexpensive. They can repair, they can replace, they can add the leaf guards, like I mentioned. They can clean them out if that's all you want done. Whatever you need done, they can do it. They're available on the east and west side of the state, and they can take care of your work in a hurry. They came out and did my stuff in February. The brothers just do gutters. The great thing about them is they just do gutters. They don't do anything else. They are passionate about gutter work, which is not what I'm passionate about, but I'm glad someone is, so they can do the right work that needs to be done. So you can get 10% off if you mention Final Four. You can find contact information for their services underneath in the description below your podcast player or on the website. You can also find it at thebrothersgutters.com. You can contact Kurt if you're on the west side of the state, or Greg on the east side of the state. So they got you covered. They can take care of all that really bad water problems that we have in Michigan. It's both a a blessing and a curse to have all this water. So make sure you take care of it and don't have it cause problems in your house. All right. So let's talk about the newcomers who everyone is very excited. A top recruiting class for Tom Izzo. And we'll start with Jeremy Fears, 6'1" freshman point guard from Joliet, Illinois. Has, as by all accounts, had a seamless transition into college game. The McDonald's All-American, referred to as the next Mateen Cleaves by his coach, and actually Mateen Cleaves in some respects, just because of his leadership, his toughness. We had him on our show. You can listen to that interview back when he committed back last year. Our expectation is he'll play a lot. He's the one you referred to or alluded to earlier as the accountability for AJ Hoggard if he starts not playing the way Izzo wants. And so, a guy who can shoot, guy who can handle the ball and defend. So, I mean, I don't know. What else do you want?
I think he's going to play a big role. And it's his addition that I think is, if possible, is being underplayed by people. Because it's not just, well, okay, you're going to rest AJ Hoggard 10 minutes a night, so he'll play those 10 minutes. Nope. They'll play together sometimes. It's one of the advantages of AJ being 6'4", that, he can guard bigger players. So you could defensively, that could work, I just love everything I've seen from AJ Hoggard or for Jeremy Fears, watching him the last couple of years as he's been a recruit and then a committed recruit. I've loved, and then you listen to the things Izzo has said about him. It's all coming to fruition. Everything I thought was the case. I mean, we talked to Jeremy last winter and we asked him how much contact he'd had with Mateen. And and again, I'm not trying to pat us on the back, but we knew this. And now to hear Izzo saying exactly the same things is just great, because I know what anybody listening to this should know what that means. When he says our Mateen Cleaves of this generation, that's massive. It's massive in terms of what it can mean on the court. It's massive in terms of what it can mean in leadership. I mean, Michigan State has not had, when we think about Tom Izzo and the ideal of his program, one of the things you usually think about is, well, he's got a leader on that team who's just an ass kicker, keeps everybody in line, dragging people with him. And the reality is that we don't have a lot of them. We had Mateen Cleaves and Antonio Smith early on, then Travis Walton, then Draymond Green. We haven't had one since Draymond Green, so that's more than a decade ago. That kind of personality type. Had great players, Denzel Valentine, Cassius Winston, Miles Bridges, Jaren Jackson, lots of great players. Not that kind of leader. Jeremy Fears, I think, is that kind of guy. And that's an intangible that will matter. How much will it matter on this team that has so many veterans in key spots? That remains to be seen. But in the long run, it's going to be huge. In terms of his impact on this team, you could use him to hold people accountable. It improves the depth. So when Michigan State goes to its bench, they're not giving up anything. And I truly believe that. I don't think they're going to give up very much, because Jeremy Fears can do all the things Izzo wants his point guard to do. He can guard the hell out of you. He makes other people better, and he can also get his own offense. That doesn't mean he's a perfect player, He can improve his consistency as a jump shooter. Decision-making is always a work in progress, but man, there aren't many freshmen I've been more excited about in totality than I am with Jeremy Fears.
Yeah. What you like so much about it too is the fact that you have a guy who has those leadership qualities, but actually can do all the other things too, right? Like you see a guy like Travis Walton or Tum Tum Nair, great leaders, but they weren't able to provide that production that you're going to get from someone like him, that we just suspect you're going to get from someone like him. So it makes him, it's like a unicorn in some respects. So very exciting to have him. And just the thought that, if a team can say, oh, good, Hoggard's out, so we can kind of rest for a little bit, you can get bombarded by someone else who's, attacks you maybe differently, but it's
they're not going to give up much. And that's a rarity.
Yeah, for sure. All right. So now we're going to talk about the X factor for the team, Cone Carr, 6'6", 220-pound freshman out of Georgia. I think it's fair to say he's the best athlete on the team. Maybe the conference. and
Maybe the
beyond, who
country.
knows?
Maybe
It's
the
hard to
country.
say, right? Not a McDonald's All-American though. He's with the joke is that you leave a quarter on the top of the backboard and he'll go grab the quarter and leave you two dimes, a nickel or something. So explosive as a leaper. Obviously, the questions obviously with guys like this is, what is the work ethic like? What's the jump shot? What is the rest of the game? Can you, just because you're a great athlete, can you play great defense? Do you play great defense? Do you kind of fade out during the game? And those will be the big questions for him. I mean, if he can do a lot of those things, you expect that he's going to be able to rebound with the physical skills. Is he tough enough to do that? I mean, his body looks like a guy who's not a freshman. So in that sense, I think he's okay. But, those are all the questions, but I think they seem to be answered at least as much as they could possibly be answered in the offseason.
Look, he's going to play a role on this team. Like, the question is exactly what and how big. And there are two guys, he and the next guy we'll talk about, that I think are the potential X factors for Michigan State in terms of a difference from where they will be in November to where they will be in March. Because as they get more comfortable and hopefully have an increased role, Michigan State's ceiling goes up because these guys change the athletic profile of this team. Cohen Carr might be the best athlete in the country. There are a lot of people, and I might be among them, who feel like he might actually be the best athlete of the Izzo era, which, when you consider that includes Jason Richardson and Shannon Brown, says an incredible amount. But it might be true. And as Izzo has pointed out, so the difference is, Jason was that kind of athlete at 6'6" and 180 when he came in, 190. Cohen Carr is 6'6" and 220. So it's a different thing. I think the question with him, offensively, it's going to be how consistent is the jumper, and that's a work in progress. But I actually, from what I saw even last season, I don't think his release looked bad. I think it's just going to be repetition, getting reps, and you'll just find more consistency with it. He's got a good handle for a guy of his profile. So I think in time he might be pretty effective going to the rim. He's already got enough that in transition and on the offensive glass should be lethal. But I think the biggest thing in terms of his role is going to be defense. And we're not going to know until we actually see him on the floor. You hear reports about things, but until we see it in game action, you just don't know where he's at. But I think defense will be what tells the tale. And I look, his physical profile suggests he could be an outstanding defensive player, not just a good one. But there's a learning curve too, and we just don't know yet where he's at on that. But sky's the limit. Again, as I say, where he'll be in March, I think, is going to be very different than where he is in November. And that should scare the ever-loving shit out of the Big Ten and the country, by the way.
Absolutely. And that just reminds me of our next player, Xavier Booker, who is maybe really an X factor. Xavier, 6'11", top 10-ish recruit. It was actually at some point, I think, even listed as number one recruit of the season. 5-star recruit, obviously. So he's the ultimate stretch four, right? He's a guy who can handle the ball and can shoot, and he's going to be the backup to the four. And I think, when we were looking at Michigan State's profile after Booker committed, our expectation was, and you'd heard some rumblings from Michigan State, that certainly Booker would be the starter, and that you'd have the Michigan State bring in some other player off the transfer portal to play the four, to hold him accountable to, if he's having a rough day or whatever, that he could play behind him. But I think he's probably in a better situation this way, because he's going to be playing behind Malik Hall. There's not going to be as much expected of him. And so hopefully be a little bit more relaxed and comfortable in growing into that role, as you said, which will probably change throughout the year.
That's the hope, Look, I think there's been a lot of talk that's gone maybe a bit too far in the other direction, like, oh, he's not ready to help. I don't believe that. I think he can help this team right away. But is he going to look like what people think of as a number one recruit in the country? Probably not early. The good news is, in terms of where he's at, and just as importantly, those around him, it seems as if there is what you hope for at a place like Michigan State, that he needs to get stronger. He needs to understand and then put into action on the floor the kind of motor, the kind of effort. And that's not to say that he's lazy. I just think sometimes with high school players, especially with bigs, they don't understand what's required in terms of motor to play at a place like Michigan State. You hope that that's inherent, and sometimes it is, but sometimes it isn't. That's something that's got to change. All that said, Xavier Booker is ranked where he's ranked for some very obvious reasons. He's 6'11", yet a very good straight line athlete, to the point that I actually think in time he could be somebody that could take people off the dribble. He's that guy. He's got a good handle. You don't see in guys his size with regularity. He has a potential to be an outstanding shooter, probably needs some continued work in terms of consistency. And he's got good length, so he should be in time an effective rim protector. How big the role is remains to be seen. But again, I will be surprised, very, very surprised, if we are talking about him in exactly the same terms in March as we are in November. I think for a guy like him, these 4 or 5 months, you're going to see radical change. And so the goal, if you're Michigan State, is make sure that he is ready by March to be a serious impact guy. And I think that's a realistic goal.
And finally, rounding out the 12-man roster, Garrick Norman, 6'5" Texan, who everyone harkens back to Matt McQuaid. He's a dead-eye shooter from Texas, and we've had him on the show twice, I think, too. So you can go back and listen to those interviews as well. Great kid. It's definitely understands. I mean, when you talk to him, he definitely sounds like he understands his role. He definitely understands the fact that, and he has that right attitude, I guess I'd say, that he's going to work hard. He's going to, he cares more about the team, and they're not platitudes when he's saying either that. At least my impression was that he actually truly believed those things. And I think when he broke his hand or his thumb or something like that, just diving for a ball, like the second game of his high school season, when he's like their best player. And so I think that's a good sign of the kind of player you want at Michigan State.
You know, again, some comparisons that we saw pretty early, and I think the accuracy of which has been confirmed by the things you hear Tom Izzo say, the Matt McQuaid comparisons, which are easy to make. Dallas area kid, similar size, similar combination of athletic ability and skill set. But, you know, sometimes cliches are cliches because there are elements of truth to them. And I think in this case, that is the case. Now, what's different for Garrick is, you know, when McQuaid came in, there was a role waiting for him. There was a spot.
Yeah.
Garrick is in a different situation. And so it's harder to see consistent minutes unless injuries were to hit. But, you know, Izzo has talked about him being perhaps their best shooter in practice, which on this team is saying something, because you've got Tyson Walker and Jaden Akins, you know, so that means something. I think in time, Garrick Norman can be a very, very good two-way player on the wing. But the one opportunity that I think is there for him this year is he has size on the wing, and Michigan State's, you know, that top 5 group, if you're not talking about Cohen Carr, but we're talking about the 5 guards, they don't have much size. AJ at 6'4", but then after that, it's all 6'1", 6'2" guys. Garrick at 6'5" could give them that. So I could see, if he earns a level of trust and a situation presents itself where they need a little more size on the wing for a stretch, I could see that happening. That's the opportunity I think he has on this roster. But I'm with you in terms of how he comes across. I don't think he's going to be rattled or bothered by that if he's not playing consistent minutes right away. I think there's an understanding. It seems that way. As to how things look
about what his role is going to be.
But I think the future is very, very bright.
Quite an embarrassment of riches here for Michigan State compared to last year. I mean, we have 12 players who, I mean, in any other year, you could make an argument for them all starting, you know, in some respects.
9 years out of 10, anybody in that 12-man group of scholarship players would be firmly in the rotation.
And in today's modern game, it is extremely unusual to have this many players with opportunities to transfer out, to go other places, to decommit, to get more minutes. to actually be able to assemble this collection of players. Now we'll see how it all plays out, obviously, but it is pretty unusual. And a testament to Izzo, I don't know, giving the finger to the way everyone else does things or says that things have to be done. He definitely believes. And I think this is a testament to the fact that his way of doing things, relationship based, still has some role in the game.
That's it. He has said several times lately that for as long as he's running the program, it's going to be about relationships as opposed to transactional environment. And he means it. And it's not lip service. And he's also gone on record as saying, look, there may come a time where he has to get into more transactional stuff than he would like to, but that's never, ever going to be the goal. And that's never going to be how they're going to attempt to do things. The way they want to do things is exactly what we see.
Yeah.
With this team. And I think that he is proof that you can still do it that way.
Yeah. It's hard. And I think that's why people don't do it. And it has to fit your personality.
Yeah.
It has to be genuine, right? That's the other thing.
It has to be genuine. And the other thing too is, let's be fair and honest about it. Tom Izzo has gravitas.
Yeah,
so
right.
Anybody can say, well, we want to be a relationship-based program. It's a family atmosphere, blah, blah, blah. Tom Izzo's got, closing in on 30 years worth of a track record. He has guys who are pros, who are all-time greats, who can vouch for it. He's in the Hall of Fame. So when he says these things, it carries a different weight than it would for, pick your average high major or mid major coach when they say it. It is different.
Well, this is a bit of a love fest, but he's not perfect. There are things things that he's not perfect with. I suspect he's also a Packers fan, but I'm not certain about that since he's from Iron Mountain. So, let's go on to talk about the 5 keys of the season. But before we do, this is the last of our 14 installments of the Big Ten previews. There's now nothing else for you to learn from Rod. So now is the time to send in your picks for the final standings of the Big Ten. Email your predictions to me at Eric, and that's at tiffnots.com. That's ERIC at TFFINOTS.com with your 1 to 14 rankings. We'll use the Big Ten tournament standings at the end of the year. Make sure you have your name and the tiebreakers of how many points Michigan State scores against Michigan this year. They play twice. The winner takes some gift cards from Nudge Printing and also an opportunity to come on the show. Contest ends before the first Big Ten game in December. So if you want to wait and see how the Big Ten teams look, which is what people did last year and probably helped them sniff out the Purdue juggernaut before we had an opportunity to see it, you can wait, but make sure you get those in. We take whenever you can come get them in. I'll make my picks as well. I'll probably mention that at some point later. I probably will actually not have Michigan State number 1. I think I'm still going to go with Purdue this year, but other than that, I think we'll figure those out later. All right, so let's talk about the keys to the season. Number 1 is rebounding, which, that is, like you said, that is a staple of Michigan State. That's whenever you watch broadcasts, they talk about how great Michigan State is rebounding, even like last year when they weren't rebounding great, certainly on the offensive end. And they haven't been top 50 for quite some time. I guess almost 2016. So like 7 years now. And last year, 213th in offensive rebounding, which is, out of 351 teams, it's pretty bad. And so that's job number 1. And certainly talking to Mike Garland last year that, as you said, he insisted that it was still an emphasis, but it clearly wasn't at some point that they recognized it was just a weakness. They have to get around it. You're
going to know early, and you're going to know, as I say, if you're watching that game on television or if you're watching it live at the Breslin, pay attention to how many guys are around the basket when a Michigan State shot goes up that are wearing green and white. And if you're not seeing many, then you'll know we're still talking about an issue. I don't think it will be. I think 2 things have changed. 1, Michigan State's depth is much better. And again, it's not even just the bodies, but if you look at the 5s, it's that Izzo has more confidence in all of those guys. So that should translate into them playing a little more freely, in terms of pursuing offensive rebounds, let's say. I think Malik Hall being healthy, we talked about some of the things that maybe Michigan State gives up in the transition from Joey Hauser to Malik Hall at the 4. But one area Michigan State should be better is on the boards. I think Joey, or rather the offensive boards, I think Joey was a very good defensive rebounder, but he was never a strong offensive rebounder. And I don't mean to say that Malik Hall is Antonio Smith, but I think he's better in that area than Joey was. I think his mentality is oriented a little more that way. He's a little bit better athletically. That should help. But I also think the other thing that's changed besides those things, the depth and the switch, the 4, is, and also I should add in that Jaden Akins is healthy.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But I also think that 2 of the newcomers that we just talked about, Cohen Carr and Xavier Booker, are guys that as they play more, they add another level in terms of what the offensive rebounding could look like to this team. Those are guys that have the physical tools that can be game changing, And so again, if I'm looking at what can be different about this team, but in particular, what can be different about this team from between now and March, that's one area where those guys really could make a difference.
And so
but I think it's going to be better. I'm confident in that. It needs to be better. And that's one way in which Michigan State gets back to being quote unquote Michigan State.
Second key to the season, pace. So it goes along with rebounding quite a bit. Michigan State is usually transition oriented, as we mentioned earlier. Not so last year. I mean, the offensive possession length was number 273rd in KenPom, which is, again, super slow. And we were always kind of joking that they were like Wisconsin, which is their lowest since KenPom began keeping track of statistics back in 2010. So, and it was not just a function of the opponents, obviously. I mean, when you're playing that slow, it's more your decision than it is your opponent stopping you from doing it.
Correct.
Because they were always trying to stop before.
I think that it was clearly by design and for good reasons, but I don't think those reasons are operative right now. It's funny. There's a University of Michigan account that I look at from time to time called U of M Hoops.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I know, but it was interesting. There was just the other day there was the media poll released, and he was one of the participants in it, and was talking about how he had Michigan State picked second, but he said he didn't really see how there were obvious weaknesses for Michigan State last year, which is true, and he wasn't sure that there were obvious reasons why it would be different this year, which again, I understand if you're outside, you don't cover Michigan State, you don't focus on Michigan State, how you wouldn't understand how some of these changes, some of these differences could be critically important in altering some of those things. One of the things he pointed out was that Michigan State was a very poor shooting team from inside the arc. They were incredible from 3. But they needed to be because they weren't very good. They were in the mid to high 200s from 2. Yeah. Well, why is that? Well, one reason it's very obvious is we've talked about it some. They didn't have a reliable low post option to dump the ball into. That's true. And I'm not sure that that's changed radically this year. I think Jackson Kohler will be better, but I also don't think, if he were going to play 28, 30 minutes a night, okay, maybe that changes things. I don't think he will. So that's probably not radically different. But one thing that could and should be very much different, and a way that you generate 2-point productivity, is getting into transition consistently. When you're shooting layups and dunks on the break, those are 2-point baskets, and they tend to be pretty efficient ones. And Michigan State did very, 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 very little of that last year. There is no reason to suspect that they will not be completely different this year, and much more along the lines of what we've typically seen from Tom Izzo teams. That is true because of the caliber of guard play, but it is mostly true because of the increased depth and higher octane athleticism that is on this roster. So that's one thing that I can excuse people who don't focus on Michigan State very much, but it's a way in which playing at a higher tempo, getting into transition more consistently, can really alter the entire offensive profile of this team. And frankly, I expect it to. I will be disappointed if it's not altered.
Yeah. I mean, I've never felt that Michigan State has an elite half-court offense. I think they've been very good, but never. Maybe the pick and roll with Winston and Tillman was an area where they were really great.
I think they have, but I understand the point.
Yeah.
It's you don't think of Michigan State as, I don't know, like peak Villanova.
Right. Yeah.
In the half court.
So number 3 key to the game or season, and this is one actually when you were talking about the things that you think of when you think of Michigan State, you said rebounding and running, and my thought was like, well, defense is you have to have. Michigan State has always been really good defensively, and it's a focus. And you could argue you could do the other things really well, and you still may not play as much if Izzo thinks you're not defending well. And so last year, Michigan State was very good. I mean, they were number 42, which is quite improvement over the previous year, but it's not where we've expected to see Michigan State in the past, where they're usually top 30. They were in top 10 even for the years 17, 18, and 19, 20. So by what our discussion, they're certainly adding pieces that make you think that there's an opportunity for them to really improve on that this season.
They got better last year, but I think Tom Izzo will be the first to say the 42nd best defense is not good enough at Michigan State, and it's not. So then I think the question becomes, are there the pieces to enable them to think that they can be better still? And I think there are. Again, I keep saying the same thing, but depth is going to help because you have fresher players. And so the more guys you can play, the better rested the guys on the court should be at any given moment, and that should help you. I think that there's the potential for better rim protection. Michigan State wasn't much of a shot blocking team last year. I think that, as guys like Sissoko and Cooper are better, and you've added guys like Carr and Booker, there's potential to be better there than they were. But one interesting thing has come up recently, and I got to give credit to Jim Comparoni of Spartan Mag, because he's the only guy I've seen thus far who's talked about it. If you go back to the 2004-2005 season, Michigan State had a lot of depth, similarly to what they have this year. And one of the ways Izzo opted to utilize that depth was he had that team play full court man-to-man pressure. So don't think about Nolan Richardson 40 minutes of hell or Brad Underwood 40 minutes of disaster or whatever you think of when you think about trapping defenses that are looking to try and turn you over. It's not what it was. It was man pressure. And the idea was not to create turnovers, but rather take a physical and mental toll on your opponent. Over time, Michigan State in the Izzo era was a team that often used to look to the last, say, 8 to 10 minutes of a game and say, that's our time.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
The game might be close up until then, but they would wear opponents down. And the early years of his tenure, when you were allowed to play more physically, that often manifested itself that way. That guys just got tired of trying to come across the lane and avoid body checks. And it would kind of wear them out. You can't really play that way anymore. But one way the 04-05 team did it was through this man pressure. I think there's an opportunity for this team to play that way. And according to Jim, that is exactly what Izzo's planning to do. And if he follows through on it, he's mentioned it a time or two in the past when he's had deeper rosters and then backed off. But I look at this team and I see no reason why they shouldn't play that way. all of his guards have the ability, I think, to be effective doing that. You know, there's not a Cassius Winston or Travis Trice where you look at them and you say, well, that guy's not really built for 40 minutes of that. That's not ideal. These guys are, in my opinion.
Well, and you don't, with the roster, you don't need 40 minutes. I mean, you can get
That's right.
25 minutes.
That's
and
right.
you're not having
That's
huge
the
drop
idea.
offs, right? That's the thing.
That's the idea. So it can help you in two ways. One is, again, it exacts that physical and mental toll from the opponent. But I think the other thing that's really important is when now we're comparing to 2004-05, you've got a shot clock that's 5 seconds less than it was then. When you're talking about a 30-second shot clock and you're forcing the opponent to consistently use up 8 seconds, 9 seconds before they can even get into their offense. And even then, they might not be able to cleanly get into it once they get across half court. That should help your defensive efficiency. Just because the opponent has less time to run their stuff.
Yeah.
Right? So you would think that's going to help. So I think all of those things kind of combine, but to give this team hope to be better on the defensive end. But I think if Michigan State's going to be an elite team, I think they need to get back to being an elite or near elite defensive team. And I think there's a chance for that.
Yeah. And I think it's important to point out too, I mean, when you talk about the depth, I mean, every team has 12 players, or I mean, for the most part, right? Unless you've got some injuries, but it's actually the depth, the quality of the depth that you have.
For sure.
Right. And that does pose a problem potentially for Izzo as well, that you have so many people who are, deserve minutes. And so the one way you can get around that is just make them really tired. So they're okay coming out after getting a blow after 10-minute stretch or 8 minutes or something like that. So that'd be one way to sort of solve that problem a little bit. Going on to the next key to the season, valuing the ball. Michigan State finished 62nd in turnover percentage, which, obviously that is the best finish ever by Izzo team. Only one other team has finished the top 100. So a very unusual team last year in the sense that valuing the ball, partly because they probably didn't run as much. And then that was sort of our theory in some respects, or mine anyway. And then Garland said, well, yeah, but the fact that they have so many people who can handle the ball is the majority of the reason, he believed. But I think it was, the style play and the fact that they have so many people who can handle the ball.
Yeah. And look, I don't think they need to be in the top 65 next year for this to be good enough. Right. But I do think, let's put it this way. If Michigan State can even remain a top 100 team in terms of turnover percentage and play at the kind of ramped up pace that we've been discussing, that's a huge positive. It's a rarity to see a Michigan State team value the ball as well as that team did last season. And I don't see any reason to think that it should be radically different this year. I think they are going to look to be a little more aggressive. They're going to take a few more chances. So that's all true. But I don't think it should become the kind of issue that we're used to talking about turnovers being with this group, And you just think about it. If you've got even a top 100 turnover percentage team that's playing fast, look out.
So the fifth key to the season, you might have mentioned it once or twice, AJ Hoggard.
Yeah, I mean, it's that simple. He's got to be the best version of himself. There are reasons why it's maybe not quite as important or quite as critical. We've talked about Jeremy Fears, Tyson Walker, Jaden Akins having more responsibility, Trey Holloman being more consistent. But look, there are things that AJ does that the rest of them don't. Not the same way. And he's that guy. I mean, I think he is, once again, if you're looking for an individual and saying this guy is really the key to the season, he's the guy.
I guess then we can kind of spin off and start talking about the season and just kind of go through the schedule briefly. And I guess what we kind of expect. Uh, Before we begin that, I just want to remind everyone that this is the place. If you have not yet subscribed to the show, my goodness, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any of the shows. They're all free. We'll have a pregame and postgame analysis for each game. So you want to know sort of what to watch for, and then what afterwards, what happened, and then sort of what we think improved upon, etc. We'll have some special guests. I think we're hoping to get back maybe Bagrakis, maybe Mike Garland comes on again, although he's got his own podcast now, I guess. I've not had a chance to listen to that, but anyway, make sure you have to subscribe so you don't miss any of all this information. So you can be well prepared for every Michigan State basketball game, especially this year. I think it's going to be a special year. There's every reason to think that it's going to be pretty great. So we'll begin with Hillsdale and Tennessee are exhibition games to start the season. I think, Hillsdale will be more traditional exhibition game. I'm not even sure if it's on TV, probably BTN Plus or something like that would be my guess. It would sort of called by college students. And then the Tennessee game, which will be maybe a little different because that was planned to be a closed practice, a closed exhibition. And then they're going to open it up now as a charity game, as a number of other schools like Illinois and Kansas are playing, I think, and some other games. So that might be more of a traditional game, but there might also be some situational things. They might have like a dunk contest. I mean, it's anyone's guess what's really that's going to look like, but Hillsdale will be more the first opportunity to see the freshmen play and see all the players as far as, how they look.
Yeah. I think the Tennessee game is obviously the one I'm really intrigued by.
Right. Of course.
They haven't really let much out of the bag yet in terms of what the format's going to look like. Sometimes they don't do these as exhibition games per se. They do more situational stuff, et cetera. But regardless, the fact that you're going up against another high caliber opponent, and that gives you an early level check, as it did last season. Reportedly they played very well when MSU went down there to face a very good Tennessee team. And that ended up, I think carrying over to an extent, like you felt like, well, if Michigan State could hang with that group, not at full strength, that's a good sign for what they could be during the season. And in fact, we saw where it ended up. So it'll be a nice level check for them to get.
And then Michigan State has a couple warm-up games, James Madison, Southern Indiana. And I believe Southern Indiana, if I recall correctly, is maybe 350th out of 351 in KenPom as far as teams.
Yeah.
So that may be a definite century mark as far as scoring. And then the Champions Classic against Duke, which is another top 5 program. That's gonna be the first real big test, and we'll see. Well, I think that's when we're gonna really see what this Michigan State's really made of.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, Champions Classic is always a good indicator at an early stage. But we've seen Michigan State teams not play well and struggle in that game, and yet have very good seasons. And we've also seen the converse. I mean, we all kind of got fooled during the COVID year when MSU went to I remember it correctly. Was the Duke game part of the challenge? I think it was.
It was,
yes.
But they still played in Cameron.
Still played
the
in
empty
Cameron. Right. And Michigan State handled Duke. And I think we all felt like, oh, well. And
Duke didn't make the tournament.
Duke wasn't very good. Yeah. So Duke is ranked, in the top 2 or 3 by pretty much everybody coming into the season. So there's reason to think that they're going to be very good. I would expect that, and I would expect it to be a great game and a great challenge. But I don't see any reason Michigan State should feel as if, as we might think in some other years, that it would be an uphill battle to win this game. I think Michigan State has every chance to win it.
And then they return home and play Butler with welcome in Pierre Brooks and Thad Matta back into the Breslin Center. Butler's not expected to be that good this year, then followed by a game against Elkhorn State. And then a game on Thanksgiving, which I think that's the first time they've ever played Thanksgiving, at least that I recall, out in Palm Springs. And it's sort of a neutral site against Arizona.
Yeah, and that's going to be an interesting game. Arizona's definitely got some players. They've got some talent, and that's another top 10-ish opponent. So yeah, that'll be a challenge. Again, neutral site.
Then a few days later, and I think we had talked. I think we talked about this earlier. Is that the schedule actually lines up pretty nicely for Michigan? There's not like massive travel or like a
Yes.
short rest between games. They have 5 days to get back from California, take on Georgia Southern. Then they have a week before they open home. The first Big Ten game, that sort of that weird week before the Big Ten season really starts in January. They host Wisconsin, who is should be pretty good this season. That'll be the first game on Peacock, which I think some people are grumbling about to watch Michigan State in a streaming service, but that's just the nature of the sport right now. And then the other Big Ten game is at Nebraska on the 10th of December.
Yeah, and Wisconsin certainly an interesting test. I expect them to be competitive, but at Breslin, that's one you would think you can win, and then going on the road against Nebraska again, maybe a little more competitive Nebraska team than we've seen in recent years. But if you're looking at road games, that's one. If you're a Big Ten contender, you think you probably ought to get.
Yeah, for sure. And then the rest of about 6 days take on Baylor in Detroit, Little Caesars, which should be an interesting match. I think we suspect that they'll be playing Baylor next year, somewhere down in Texas, but again, a neutral site.
Yeah, probably maybe in Dallas. I don't know, but I like this schedule because you've got 3 top 10-ish teams. Baylor might maybe a little bit outside of that. Let's say 3 top 20 teams, but it's spaced appropriately. There's no obviously onerous travel that should impact a result. And they're good tests. I think the one caveat to that would be you'd maybe like to have one of them be a true road game.
Right. There are no true,
and that's where,
strangely, there aren't any this.
That's where the impact of the Big Ten ACC challenge going away hits, because that every other year you're going to get one of those. Strangely, MSU's in the Gavitt games again. That's the Butler game, but they're getting a home game for the second year in a row in that. So I'm not sure. That never happened with the ACC challenge. That was always 1 year home, 1 year on the road. And they don't have that this year. So that's the one test you would like. But again, they're going to Nebraska in December. So it's not as if they won't have any road game experience by the time they re-enter Big Ten play. They will have that one.
I think we can safely say the Gavitt games are just weird. I haven't quite figured out the whole deal with them.
Yeah.
So, and what might be a difficult transition is they're only 2 days later, Michigan State hosts Oakland on the 18th. So 2 days after the Baylor game. But again, that's not much travel going from Detroit to East Lansing. And against a lesser opponent that they should handle okay. Followed by Stony Brook. And then not quite New Year's Eve, but almost the day before New Year's Eve, Indiana State, the first rematch since the 1979 national championship game.
That one is quietly an interesting game because Indiana State has a very good team. They're expected to be a contender in the Missouri Valley. And so that might have the appearance of, it's, holiday season, relive the glory of 79. I don't know if Magic and or Bird are planning on being there. I would think there's a chance for Magic. I'm not sure about Bird.
I'd be surprised.
But Indiana State's actually pretty good. And so I would actually, in fact, I think Indiana State might be better than Butler. That might be the 4th best opponent Michigan State plays in the non-conference.
Yeah, I could definitely buy that. Missouri Valley can be very good, especially the top tier teams, for sure.
And they have the look of a team that should be a contender in that league.
Then we move on to the Big Ten season. We open at home against Penn State, then on the road for both the Illinois schools, Northwestern and then University of Illinois. And I think the Illinois Northwestern they play twice. As I try and scroll up and down the schedule here, but I think that'll be a good start to and a very reasonable beginning. I think you'll have a good idea of where Michigan State has a chance in the Big Ten standings, because my guess is you have to get the game at Northwestern, obviously, and you have to get the game at Illinois, I think, in order to have a real chance at the Big Ten title, because I think Purdue's going to be steamrolling a lot of these teams as well.
Maybe. I mean, let's not forget, for all the Purdue juggernaut talk, they lost 5 games last year.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Look, I think just without going over every game, one thing that's been pointed out is MSU and Purdue only meet once. It's late in the year. It's in West Lafayette.
Right.
So that's advantage Purdue. And I buy that certainly, but I don't think it just comes down to that. I think, again, one of the things I like about this schedule is I did not see, when I looked at it when it was finally released, I did not see a lot of obvious traps. We're used to seeing situations where, you can see there's Michigan State's getting bit by travel and or maybe the opponent or venue they're playing in. And you see, you could point to games and say, well, that probably is a loss, not because they're not better than that team, but because of circumstances,
Right.
I didn't see much of that. I really didn't. And when I look at the schedule, honestly, the only game that I looked at and said, well, they're not getting that one is that game at Purdue.
Yeah.
And that has to do with what Purdue is as a team and that Michigan State almost never plays well at Mackey. Even when they're better than Purdue, they don't play well at Mackey. So I'm putting that one down as an L, but honestly, the other 19, I think they got a shot. Right now, that's how I feel about it. So that's pretty good. That's not normal.
The other interesting thing is, the only time they play Indiana is also at Indiana to finish the season.
Yeah, but that's, MSU has played well at Assembly Hall.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Generally speaking, it's not the snake pit that Mackey is. I would even say it's not as tough as, what do they call it now? State Farm, the other Assembly Hall at Illinois.
Yeah, right.
That's a tougher building to me. That doesn't mean that they'll win at Indiana, but it's not a building that scares me. And that Indiana team, I'm not convinced by. I think they'll be okay, but I'm not convinced that they're any kind of juggernaut. So
the one devil's advocate thing I would say about this season that you're hearing is, you look at Michigan State team and they're bringing back basically the same teams they had last year. Last year, they lost 8 games. And how have they improved so much that you think that they're now going to be a top 10 team? I mean, I know they had a good run at the tournament, but what is it about this team this year that is going to be so dramatically different than last season that we should be so much more hopeful for how they're going to finish?
Well, it's a number of the things we've talked about, but I think the number one thing, if I had to point to one thing above all others, it's that increased depth should allow Michigan State to be what we think of historically as Michigan State on a regular basis. And that, in turn, should mean there should be less bouts of inconsistency than we saw. So last year, when all you can do offensively really is score via the 3, right? That's the equation. You got to hit jump shots if you're going to score. Well, that's usually, even if you're an elite shooting team from range, which Michigan State was, that's still going to be more volatile than if you are a more versatile offensive team. And we've talked about how Michigan State should be a much more diverse offensive team this year with increased depth and also with some of the personnel additions they've made. They should do more in terms of second chance scoring. They should do more in terms of transition scoring. So I think those things are going to make this team much more consistent on a game in, game out basis. I also think the increased depth and some of the personnel changes, both to returning players and their bodies and also just new players, new faces, has the potential to make them a more consistent and higher level defensive team. So that's why. That's my response. And it's a fair question, by the way. I alluded to the U of M Hoops writer basically asking that, making that point. And I get it. Just because you got guys coming back doesn't necessarily mean you're automatically better. That's true. But I think when you understand what Michigan State is typically and why the changes that have occurred put them in position to be a more consistent team and more of a conventional Michigan State team, and how that should in turn improve consistency, I think that's where the optimism comes from. And I'm not just talking about, the national media typically, when they make these picks, is focusing on what you did in March and how many guys you've got coming back. So that's why Michigan State is in the top 5. They're not in the top 5 necessarily for all the reasons we've just articulated. They're in the top 5 for much more simplistic reasons.
Recruiting class 2 as part of that, as well.
That too, yes. All those things. But if you get beyond that and you drill down and you say, okay, how do all of these things actually make them better? That's where I think the grounded reasons for optimism should come from.
Well, one of my main reasons for optimism this season is we had the seat reassignment, Rod, and I have.
You're away from the heckler?
I'm away from that. Well, I only assume I am.
You think you are?
We've moved a number of sections over. The likelihood of him being by me now. There are other hecklers, I'm sure, in this, but we've never had one as bad as him. So we're very excited. I think it'll be a great year.
Good.
But we'll see. I guess is the just like the proof's in the pudding here, right? So we're going to wrap this up, and hopefully, I imagine this took you 1 or 2 or 3 or maybe a whole week's worth of commuting to get through this episode. But we all like doing the nice deep dive on the team, so you have a really good feel for what's coming. And just as a reminder, visit our great sponsors. Go to Nudge Printing, nudgeprinting.com, 20% off your orders if entering Final Four into the coupon code at checkout. Go to Brothers to Just Do Gutters if you need gutter work. You get 10% off if you contact them and mention Final Four. Also, if you've not yet had a chance to support the show and you're like, you guys are awesome, I really like what you do, here's, a cup of coffee. You can set that up, either one-time gifts via PayPal or Venmo on a recurring basis through Patreon or Substack. And if you want to have an opportunity to advertise in the show, we're more than happy to have more sponsors of the show. Get a hold of me at eric@tffinots.com. And also, we are having the contest for the Big Ten to Beat Rod contest. 1 through 14, the Big Ten standings on the finals. Make sure you add your name, number of points, and tiebreakers. The tiebreaker is number of points that Michigan State scores against Michigan this season. Again, email it to me at eric@tiffnots.com. And if you're not yet subscribed to the show, please do so. Leave a comment in your podcast player. It helps the algorithms a ton. And the next show I think it's going to be the pregame for the Hillsdale game. So we will talk to you guys soon. And until then, the Final Four is on the schedule. Go green.
Thank you.